In this episode, we connect two worlds that beginners often keep separate in their minds. The world of ethical AI principles, like fairness and transparency, and the world of governance and audit evidence, like approvals, controls, documentation, and review records. It is easy to say an organization values responsible AI, but values only matter when they show up in decisions that shape what gets built, what data gets used, what gets released, and what gets stopped. Governance is the system of rules and responsibilities that forces those decisions to happen in a consistent way, and audit evidence is how you prove, later, that the decisions were real and not just good intentions. When business pressure is high, organizations often talk about ethics while quietly making choices that contradict it. Your job in this lesson is to learn how to tie an ethical principle to a specific governance decision and then to the kind of evidence that should exist if that decision actually happened. Once you can make that connection, you can evaluate responsibility in a practical way rather than relying on slogans. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Start by treating ethical principles as requirements that must be translated into actions. Fairness is not a wish. It becomes a requirement to evaluate performance across relevant groups and to address disparities before deployment. Privacy is not a vibe. It becomes requirements for data minimization, purpose limits, access controls, retention limits, and vendor restrictions. Transparency is not an abstract ideal. It becomes requirements for user notice, explanation, and internal documentation that supports oversight. Safety is not a marketing statement. It becomes requirements for testing, monitoring, incident response, and a clear plan for failure modes. Accountability is not a poster. It becomes requirements for named owners, approval gates, and escalation paths. If you learn to translate principles into requirements, the governance question becomes much easier because you can ask whether there is a decision point where each requirement is checked and enforced. This is the bridge between ethics and governance. Now define governance decisions in a beginner-friendly way. A governance decision is any moment when someone with authority chooses whether to proceed, modify, limit, or stop an AI activity. This can happen when a project is proposed, when a dataset is selected, when a model is trained, when a system is tested, when it is deployed, or when it is changed after deployment. Each decision should have a trigger, like adding a new data source, expanding to a new user group, or using the model in a higher stakes setting. Each decision should have criteria, like minimum performance thresholds, privacy constraints, or transparency obligations. Each decision should have an owner, meaning someone responsible for the call, not a vague committee that cannot be held accountable. When an organization has these decision points, ethics has a place to live. When it does not, ethics tends to become optional, especially when deadlines tighten. Audit evidence is how you confirm that governance decisions were made with real consideration and not after-the-fact storytelling. Evidence is not only a final report. It is a trail of artifacts that show what was considered and what was decided. For example, evidence can include a risk assessment completed before training, an approval record that lists the agreed safeguards, a data inventory entry that describes the dataset's purpose and retention, and test results that show performance across groups. Evidence can also include records of change reviews, logs of monitoring alerts, and documentation of incidents and follow-up actions. Beginners sometimes assume audit evidence must be thick binders of paperwork, but good evidence can be simple as long as it is specific, consistent, and created at the right time. The key is that evidence should exist because governance happened, not because someone scrambled to create documents when an auditor asked. Timeliness and traceability are what make evidence credible. Let's tie fairness to governance decisions and evidence. The governance decision connected to fairness is often the decision to approve a model for a particular use case and population. A fairness-aware governance process sets criteria like acceptable differences in error rates across groups, or at least requires that differences be measured and explained. It also requires that the data used for training and testing represents the populations the model will affect. Audit evidence for fairness can include the evaluation plan that defines what groups and conditions were tested, the results showing performance breakdowns, and the remediation plan if disparities were found. Evidence can also include documentation about label quality, because biased labels make fairness testing meaningless. A strong sign is that the organization can show how fairness findings changed the system, such as adding data for underrepresented groups, changing features that act as proxies, or narrowing the use case to reduce harm. If fairness is claimed but no evidence of group-aware evaluation exists, the ethical principle has not been operationalized. Now tie privacy to governance decisions and evidence. Privacy governance decisions appear when a team selects data sources, defines retention, decides whether prompts and outputs are logged, and decides whether a vendor will process data. Privacy criteria include minimization, purpose limits, consent or notice obligations, access restrictions, and data handling requirements for sensitive categories. Audit evidence for privacy includes a data mapping record that explains how information flows through training and operation, a justification for each data category used, and documented retention and deletion processes. Evidence also includes vendor agreements or vendor restrictions that limit reuse and retention, and records of privacy reviews for changes. In an AI context, you also look for evidence that rights requests, like deletion requests, are handled in a way that is honest about training and model updates. When privacy is real, you see decisions that remove data, shorten retention, or restrict access even when it would have been convenient to do otherwise. Ethics becomes visible when privacy choices cost something and the organization still makes them. Transparency is often where organizations struggle, so it is helpful to be specific about the governance decision. The key decision is what the organization will tell users and internal stakeholders about the AI system, and how those explanations are delivered. Transparency criteria include whether users are notified when AI influences decisions, whether the system's limitations are communicated, and whether there is a way to contest or escalate. Audit evidence can include the content of user notices, the explanation scripts used by staff, and documentation that describes the model's purpose, inputs, and intended use. Evidence should also include internal guidance about what the model output means and what it does not mean, because misuse often happens when people treat a score as truth. A strong program can show that transparency is tailored to impact, meaning higher stakes uses have clearer notice and stronger appeal paths. If transparency is only a general statement and not a specific communication plan, then it is not tied to governance. Safety and reliability connect to governance through launch criteria, monitoring decisions, and incident readiness. The governance decision here is whether the system is safe enough to deploy and what conditions must be true to keep it running. Safety criteria include testing for harmful outputs, managing uncertainty, reducing misuse pathways, and ensuring the system fails in a controlled way when it is uncertain. Reliability criteria include performance stability over time and clear triggers for retraining, pausing, or rollback. Audit evidence includes test results, risk analyses of failure modes, monitoring dashboards or reports, and records of incidents and responses. Evidence also includes documentation of who is on call for issues and what the escalation path is when safety concerns arise. A strong sign is that the organization has records of pausing or adjusting the system based on monitoring, because that shows safety governance is active rather than passive. If safety is claimed, but there is no monitoring evidence, ethics is not being maintained after launch. Accountability is the ethical principle that makes other principles enforceable, and it connects directly to governance structure. The governance decision connected to accountability is defining who owns the system and who has authority to approve or stop it. Accountability criteria include clear roles, separation of duties where appropriate, and escalation mechanisms when conflicts arise. Audit evidence includes role assignments, decision logs, approval records, and meeting minutes or governance artifacts that show decisions being made. Evidence can also include training records that show responsible parties understand their obligations. A practical way to test accountability is to ask who can say no, and then ask for an example of a time that power was used. If nobody can point to a real decision where a risky approach was rejected or modified, accountability may exist only in theory. Ethical accountability is demonstrated by action, not by titles. To make this whole concept usable, learn to think in a pattern: principle, decision, criteria, evidence, and follow-through. Principle is the ethical value, like fairness. Decision is where that value is enforced, like approving the model for use. Criteria are the concrete checks, like performance breakdowns across groups. Evidence is what shows those checks were done, like documented results and approvals. Follow-through is what happens when the checks find a problem, like redesign or restriction, and evidence should exist for that too. This pattern helps you avoid being impressed by vague statements because you immediately ask where the decision point is and what proof exists. It also helps you see gaps, like a principle that has criteria but no enforcement, or enforcement that exists but is not documented. A mature governance program makes this pattern routine so it does not depend on individual heroics. Business pressure often creates specific governance failure modes, and you can recognize them by the evidence trail. One failure mode is backdating, where documents appear to exist but were created after the system shipped. Another is template theater, where every assessment looks identical because it was copied and pasted without real analysis. Another is bypass by exception, where urgent projects get waved through with minimal review. Evidence can reveal these patterns because you see missing records, inconsistent timestamps, vague justifications, or approvals that do not match the system's actual use. A good audit mindset is to look for consistency and specificity because real decisions create unique details. If every project has the same risks and the same mitigations, the program is not actually thinking. Ethical principles cannot survive business pressure if governance becomes a rubber stamp. It is also important to understand that audit evidence is not only for auditors, it is a tool for learning and improvement. When you record what you decided and why, you make it easier to revisit those decisions later when conditions change. A model that was acceptable for a low-impact use case might become unacceptable when it is expanded to a higher-impact setting, and evidence helps you see what assumptions you made at the time. Evidence also supports accountability because it makes responsibility visible and prevents blame shifting. For beginners, a helpful mindset is to treat evidence as a way to preserve memory, not a way to satisfy bureaucracy. Organizations that treat evidence as a nuisance tend to repeat mistakes because they cannot learn systematically. Organizations that treat evidence as a learning tool tend to build more trustworthy systems over time. To close, tying ethical AI principles to governance decisions and audit evidence is how you move from values to verifiable practice. Fairness becomes real when it drives approval criteria and produces evidence of group-aware evaluation and remediation. Privacy becomes real when it shapes data source decisions, retention, vendor restrictions, and produces evidence of minimization and purpose limits. Transparency becomes real when it produces user-facing explanations, internal guidance, and evidence that people can contest outcomes. Safety and reliability become real when launch criteria, monitoring, and incident records show the system is managed as a living risk. Accountability becomes real when named owners make documented decisions and can demonstrate when they slowed down or changed course under pressure. When you learn to ask where the decision is, what the criteria are, and what the evidence looks like, you stop relying on trust and start relying on proof. That is the foundation of responsible oversight and the reason governance exists in the first place.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.